Our next speaker is going to address Area 2 in the report, which is the security of personal rights and property rights. He's eminently qualified to talk on the subject, as he is a former judge of the Supreme Court of South Africa and the current chairman of the Free Market Foundation. He's the author of 3 books. The second one, Miracle is Not Enough, in 1998, dealt with the failures then already evident in the South African democracy. And the third book, Panic for Democracy, in 2009, deals with the equivalent failures evident in the democracy of the United States. So please welcome to explain the issues for the legal system of property rights, Rex von Schalkwyk.
The topic of my discussion this morning is property rights and the law. And it might have been thought that I would again, as others have done before me, deal with the question of expropriation without compensation. That is not my intention, partially because Martin has already very adequately dealt with this issue in a chapter that appears in the EFW report, that very comprehensive report that has been put out and made available quite recently. So it is not my intention to deal with the property rights and the law from that perspective. Rather, I've decided to deal with it from the perspective of a view that was expressed by Murray Rothbard some years ago. And he categorized the right of personal liberty as a subspecies, as a characteristic of personal ownership. In the state of liberty, he contended the individual possesses self-ownership, and the property in your person belongs to no one but yourself. Now, there are 2 distinct incidents that appear to be unrelated, but that I want to conjoin because of the relevance of those 2 incidents, international incidents, from the perspective of self-ownership and the way in which the right of self-ownership and the right of liberty have simultaneously been eroded. The first of these events was the event of 9/11, of which we have just very recently commemorated the 20th anniversary. The second event is far more recent than that, but is still with us. And that is the COVID-19 phenomenon, which started at the beginning of 2020. And as I say, that event is still with us. The first event is the one that I want to deal with first. And as we all know, that event gave rise to some very significant changes in the legal structures, both in the United States and around the world. Also, it was the start of what was called the War of Terror, the War on Terror. And we know how that War on Terror has ended quite ignominiously in the last several weeks. So one would say that the War on Terror, which was once described by an individual as the first time in the history of the world, the history of warfare, that a war has been declared against an abstract noun. But the war against terror was carried on mostly in the Middle East, and also more particularly in Afghanistan. And as I've said, it has ended ignominiously for those who proposed and put forward that idea. Now, Friedrich von Hayek wrote, and I want to quote from his views, "Emergencies have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of individual liberty have been eroded. And once they are suspended, it is not difficult for anyone who has assumed emergency powers to see to it that the emergency will persist." That is a very insightful view by a very insightful individual. And it is something that I would want the audience to bear in mind as I take you through the various developments that have occurred in connection with both the aftermath of 9/11 and in connection with the COVID-19 phenomenon. The Patriot Act was signed soon after, in fact, within weeks after the attack on America. It is a very substantial document. It contains some hundreds of pages. I think it's as many as 700 pages. And some of the Congress men and women admitted that they hadn't had a chance properly to study the Act before it was passed. Also, I think it is worth observing that the Patriot Act is rather unfortunately named. it gives a hint of what its true intention is. And very frequently, those who proclaim patriotism have something else in mind, as in this particular case. Now, it is well known that the Patriot Act contains some draconian provisions, including detention without trial, especially detention without trial for indefinite periods for, among others, for people of foreign descent. And the ignominious developments in Guantanamo Bay and that incarceration center became the center of some worldwide attention as a direct result of this enabling statute, which enabled this kind of intervention in respect of personal freedom. The Patriot Act also gave rise to some very significant surveillance, excuse me, rights of surveillance, rights of surveillance, which have been very extensively debated and for me now to enter into that debate. But it gave rise to something else, which I think is almost as sinister, if not indeed as sinister as the surveillance state itself. So various countries around the world enacted similar legislation to that of the United States. And this also gave rise to similar erosion of personal freedoms and the right of personal ownership. So the principle which I have extracted from what I call the law of adverse presumptions is that everyone is presumed to be on the wrong side of the law. Now how does that occur? Well, we know, for instance, that we've all experienced, I'm sure that we've all experienced the intrusive right which the state, through its agencies, exercises at all the airports, and in particular the international airports, and in particular the airports of the United States, which have a very bad reputation for the manner of interrogation by the security people, and also for the type of personal body searches which have been undertaken in respect of airline passenger travel. Now, one would think, of course, that airline passenger travel is something that should be readily undertaken by anybody without let or hindrance. But because 9/11 was occasioned by people who managed illicitly to convey certain weapons onto an aircraft, everybody now is presumed to have that kind of potentiality. And it is a potentiality that covers every single traveler by air around the world. Another intrusion which has been brought about by the consequences of the Patriot Act is the so-called FICA Act in South Africa, the Financial Intelligence Act. Now, that act has enabled the government to enlist the support, the active support of the various financial centers, the banks, the financial advisory services, estate agents and the like, are appointed essentially as agents of the government to enforce the law. And what the law requires is that individuals must surrender personal information of a confidential nature, in order to establish the fact that they are not either full-time criminals, or that the money that they are using for their own purpose has not been the product of some form of organized crime. Well, once again, the individuals who are affected by this kind of legislation, and the legislation is worldwide, I suspect, have found themselves in a position where they are presumed to be miscreants of the kind that the law is attempting to subvert. Well, again, we find ourselves in a position where the law itself has made an assumption against innocence and against the vast majority of the population, which simply does not fit the reality of the situation. I'm afraid it sounds as though I've got some noise in the background.
It's fine, Rex. You can continue. We can hear you clearly.
Can I continue? Sorry. Thank you. Now, these regulatory changes have been introduced and modified from time to time in accordance with international standards, which are now set out and mostly these international standards are stipulated by the United States in the interest of combating money laundering and the like. Now we come to the question of COVID-19. That, as I said, was an event that occurred at the beginning of last year, 2020. And what happened was that the world, in a most extraordinary show of unity, engaged in what is totally unprecedented in the history of the world. The lockdowns, which occurred almost all the way around the world, with some rare exceptions, such as Switzerland, such as Sweden and Taiwan, has become a feature of life. It was previously said to be something that was required for the purpose of keeping the pandemic, as it was called, under control for a brief period of time, during which the medical services would be brought up to scratch. Well, that undertaking was not fulfilled, not in any of the countries that engaged in the lockdown. But the effect of the lockdown was to treat everybody as though they were either a carrier of the disease or in some way afflicted in such a way that it was in their own self-interest that they should be. Once again, we find ourselves in a position where the world is subjected to the law of adverse presumptions, such as I mentioned before. We were all presumed to be in the same boat. Now, whatever one may say about the medical history of the Corona-19 virus, it certainly hasn't proved to be nearly as fatal or as serious as some of the most dire predictions had actually suggested. It also hasn't proven to be anything like as serious as the Spanish flu, which occurred more than 3/4 of a century ago. But in the case of the Spanish flu, the matter was dealt with more or less in the way in which Sweden had dealt with the present crisis. Those who were in danger and those who were at risk of passing the disease on to others were isolated from the rest of the population. The remainder of the population was left free to continue with business as usual. Now, the effect of these lockdowns has been dire indeed. It has been psychologically very serious upon the mentality of the vast majority of people who've been subjected to it, but it has had enormous economic consequences. It has had property right consequences. And those consequences have afflicted people across a broad range of the spectrum, including in every sense, small and medium-sized businesses, but even large-scale businesses. These businesses many of them have been permanently destroyed, never to recover. And this is a huge disadvantage to the entire society, and it is a particular disadvantage to those individuals who've had their property rights destroyed in this fashion. So it is with great sadness and great apprehension that one looks to the future to see to what extent these types of laws of adverse presumptions are going to be continued into the future. And it was a sense of apprehension that I feel that in the light of what Friedrich von Hayek has had to say, that there's every likelihood that the government will seize on every opportunity in order to expand its influence. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Rex. That is a tremendously important part of the report and a feature of the world in the last 18 months. It should be mentioned that the data in this year's report actually only goes back to 2019. It's always an 18-month delay because of its reliance on other reports that have to be published. So we're yet to see the impact of 2020 and the COVID virus in the report. But I think Rex is right to highlight the incredible imposition that governments have imposed on our freedoms in the last 18 months and how pliable society has been under those conditions.